Hello again, good morning. My name is Agata Wąsowska-Pawlik and I have a pleasure to welcome you again, but this is already the second day of our 6th Heritage Forum of Central Europe. We had very interesting and challenging discussions and presentations yesterday. We were able to listen to our two keynote speakers, Śnieżka Kwatflich-Michajlowicz and Professor Jerzy Hausner, but also we were able to follow two panel discussions. And we started with first part of parallel sessions, so it was quite, well, for us, a new experience, as it is, as I mentioned yesterday, the first fully online event on that scale. But today, there is a new day, and I have a pleasure to welcome you again. And we will start, we will connect with Australia, with Professor David Throsby from Macquarie University in Sydney. Professor Throsby, hello, we can see each other already. Professor Throsby will inaugurate the day with a lecture, Heritage-led Investment in Urban Renewal in Historic Cities. And as yesterday, I was listening to many presentations, and what was quite inspiring, that people were fully aware that heritage management is in fact the management of constant change, and the especially pandemic makes it even more. Let's say people are even more aware of that. We discussed the pressures between developers and heritage sector. So I think your today presentation will greatly broaden our horizons on that topic. Professor David Throsby is a distinguished professor of economics at Macquarie University in Sydney. He holds a master's degree from University of Sydney and PhD from the London School of Economics. He's internationally recognized for his research on economics in culture. I just want to remind that he's the most famous from his book Economics and Culture, who was also translated into Polish, but also into other 7 languages. Another book published in 2010, The Economics of Culture Policy, and both were published by Cambridge University Press. So, heritage-led investment in urban renewal in historic cities, with the example of the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Professor Throsby, the screen is yours. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Agata. It is very kind of you to have me to speak at this forum. I am very sorry that I'm not there in person. I've been looking forward for 2 or 3 years, ever since Professor Purchler made the invitation to me to come to the meeting here in the middle of 2021, and so I've been looking forward for a long time to being here, to being in Krakow at this time, and unfortunately, of course, this is not the case. But I look forward to coming again at some time in the next year or two, because Krakow is one of my favorite cities, and there'll be opportunities, of course, to come again. I would like to also congratulate the International Cultural Centre. It's having its 30th anniversary, as I'm sure you would know, and I'd like to congratulate Professor Purchler and Dr. Wąsowska-Pawlik for the work that they do in maintaining this centre, which is one of the most important cultural centres, if not the most important cultural centres in Central Europe, and has indeed a reputation which extends far further than that all around the world. And it's been a great achievement to keep the centre flourishing in the lovely surroundings that they have in there in the building in Krakow. And I look forward to another 30 years at least of continued scholarship and support for work in culture and in particular in heritage, not just in Poland but all around the world. Okay, so I'm going to let me start. The context for what I'm talking about is I'll say something about an outline for what I'm going to be talking about is broadly the context in which we talk about heritage in urban renewal. What is some of the theory, although I think most of this is fairly well known. Why we have why we regard heritage as expenditure as an investment, and what sorts of evaluation procedures can we use. With particular, I'm going to talk particularly about cost-benefit analysis as one of the things that economists use, and of course I'm an economist, and so that's why I think about these things in this way. And then I'll talk about the application of a study which we did some years ago, my colleague and myself, in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and so that helps to illustrate, I think, some of the things which I want to talk about. The context for the discussion is the existence of historic cities in just about every continent in the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, in South America, in Africa. These are all there are all historic cities which in one way or another are under pressure from modern urban expansion, and where heritage can provide a basis for urban renewal strategies. The idea is essentially that although economic development is usually the driver of urban development, and heritage sometimes has difficulty in maintaining its place in this picture and in asserting its importance, nevertheless there is a lot of scope for doing that, and that's what we want to talk about. What are the characteristics of these cities? Essentially what we see is that there's a central historic core in these cities, that the heritage in most cases, not always, but in most cases is well preserved. The streets and laneways, there's always a sort of, in the central core there will always be a pattern of development which has remained more or less unchanged, and so the streets and the laneways and the alleys and the squares tend to follow the traditional pattern, and they're still there. The social fabric is generally maintained, although it may be threatened by development, and small-scale cultural industries will still be in place. And so these are the sorts of cities that we're talking about. Now, there are plenty of examples of these sorts of cities in different parts of the world. In Europe, for example, an obvious one is Venice. Well, Venice is actually not quite a good example because Venice is a complete historic city in itself, where the cultural capital is probably more concentrated than in almost any other city in the world. But if you think about cities like Stockholm or Prague or Krakow or many more in Europe, which have a centre which has been largely kept intact, and the urban development has happened somewhere else. In the Middle East and North Africa, there are certainly plenty of examples. These tend to follow the Middle Eastern pattern of a medina or a souk or a market, which is still in use. The cities in Yemen, for example, although it's been subject to a lot of conflict in the last few years, but the city of Shibam, for example, there. In Jordan, Madaba is a well-known city which has a historic centre. Fez in Morocco, I'll say something about Fez a bit later on. In Asia, again, plenty of examples. Yangon in Myanmar has a lot of heritage in the centre, which they're thinking about trying to preserve. Penang in Malaysia, we've been doing a study, my colleague and myself have been doing a study there with the Getty Conservation Institute on the historic site of Georgetown, which is a World Heritage Site in Penang, in the island of Penang. And again, the role of heritage as a driver for development there is really a significant thing. In China, Suzhou, some people may know, it's a city of canals in China. And again, the development in that city, which is very substantial, it's quite a large city, has happened somewhere else, and the canals and the historic centre has been more or less preserved. In Latin America, finally, Quito in Ecuador, Cartagena in Colombia, Recife in Brazil. These are all cities which, by the way, have been studied extensively by the Inter-American Development Bank. An economist there who's worked a lot in heritage, Eduardo Rojas, has written about these cities in Latin America. Again, exactly the same situation, where there's a historic core which, in one way or another, has been preserved. So the question is. It's really quite a serious question. Are heritage preservation and urban development incompatible? Do we have to have one or the other, or can we have both? And the answer, as so often it happens when economists have a reputation for never being very straight about answers to questions, they tend to say, yes, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. It all depends. And of course, in the case of this question, that is in fact the answer, because it depends on how you add up the benefits and costs of alternative options. So if you think, for example, of two patterns of development for a particular historic city, one being the preservation of the heritage and perhaps the adaptive reuse of the heritage on the one hand, on the other hand, the alternative of pulling it all down and replacing it with a modern city. If you think about that, these are two alternatives, and they may well be realistic alternatives for some government who's thinking about, or some local authority who's thinking about urban planning. They may be quite genuine alternatives. And the question, to resolve the question, is how do we assess all the benefits and costs? And when I say all, I mean all the economic benefits, all the cultural benefits, all the social benefits, and so on. And that doesn't always happen. And so often, as we know, it's the economic benefits which tend to take precedence. And so, again, we're back in the same situation as I mentioned before. That is a situation where we have to be careful to understand what are the impacts of heritage on the development process. So let's think about a strategy. The first thing I would say is that, and this might sound pretty obvious to people in the audience for this forum, but nevertheless, heritage is often regarded by urban planners as an obstacle. It's a nuisance. It gets in the way of development. And in fact, I think that the important thing for us is to consider heritage as an asset, as I'll say more about in a moment, and not an obstacle. And so it is an investment. And I say investment, of course, again, as an economist, because if we see it as an investment project, it's something which yields a time stream of benefits and costs over time. And that's something which we have to take account of. There's always a stimulus to other public and private investments. And so therefore, I say all of this in order to emphasize the title of my presentation and the words which have become used in this context, which is heritage-led urban renewal. Heritage can take the lead in a process or in a strategy for urban renewal and rejuvenation. So let's just move on very briefly to the theory. I think I don't need to spend too much time on this, because it is now fairly well known that the economics of cultural heritage has developed the theoretical concept of cultural capital, which is parallel to the theory of natural capital, which is natural resources, and the cultural capital. Heritage is a very good example of cultural capital. It's an asset which is like any other capital asset from the point of view of economics, except for one thing, and that is that it has an additional form of value which it generates in addition to its economic value. And so we can say that cultural capital is a capital asset which generates both economic and cultural value. And the cultural value is the critical thing in enabling us to distinguish this form of asset from other forms that may exist in the economy. And so if we do see heritage as cultural capital, as a capital asset, then we can see expenditure on conservation, whatever we do, adaptive reuse and so on, as an investment project. And this, again, is the term and the concept and the process which economists understand, finance ministers understand, accountants understand, and so these are the people that you often have to be dealing with if you're heritage professionals. And if you can talk the same language as them, well, then that's great. That's a great help. And so to talk about investment, which has rates of return and which can depreciate, these are all the sorts of things which makes heritage an economic good, and therefore able to be analysed using the techniques of economic analysis. And the most important technique of economic analysis for any capital project is cost-benefit analysis. That's a simple proposition or simple methodology, which is used right throughout the public and private sectors in the process of appraising investment projects of various sorts. So if you're going to build a new airport or a new school, or if you're going to upgrade a freeway or something like this, these are all expenditure projects which can be seen as capital projects. And if the authority who is involved in the project, whether it's a public authority, like a government or a local authority, or if it's a private corporation, the techniques which would be used to evaluate that project would be the use of cost-benefit analysis, and so that's what we can turn to in our considerations about heritage, and so we can think about cost-benefit analysis applied to that. Now, how does it work? It's very simple. It really is based on the absolutely absurdly simple proposition that investment is worthwhile if the aggregated benefits will exceed the aggregated costs, and that makes it sound so simple that it hardly needs to be said. But the process of doing a cost-benefit analysis follows a fairly formal pattern. And that involves, first of all, what are the capital costs? What are the initial capital costs of undertaking the project? So if it's a conservation project, for example, for a building, what are the total cost of the works, which will all be incurred presumably in the first year? And then over the subsequent years, the project will give rise to benefits and costs. These are operational costs. It will depreciate. It will be it will require maintenance. It will generate benefits of one sort or another, and these are all things which have to be taken into account, leading right as far into the future as you would expect the project to last. There's some dispute or debate in the economics about how long the time horizon for an investment project should be. Should it be 30 years or 50 years or 100 years or forever? These are all questions which have to be resolved. But whatever it is, there's a time stream of benefits. But to make the decision, you have to reduce those to the value of those benefits and costs at the present moment, at the time of making the decision. And that means that they have to be discounted. Now, I won't go into the processes, but you know that a dollar or a euro or a zloty or whatever unit of currency you're talking about in a year's time or 10 years' time is different in value from now. And so you have to reduce everything to common terms of the present value. And then, having done all of that, you add everything up and the question is, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And in that context, the sort of economic benefits, which is the ones that you're looking at in the case of heritage, are first of all the use values. That is, the people who use the heritage, who will get value out of the restoration or the adaptive reuse or whatever it is. That might include owners of heritage buildings. It might include, if we're talking about tangible heritage, built heritage, it might include owners of a heritage building or site, tenants of buildings, tourists who come to visit sites and so on. These are all users. It can also apply, I should mention, just in passing, this can also apply to intangible heritage. So if we're talking about investment in, say, a festival or to preservation of some cultural traditions, then again, the beneficiaries can easily be identified. Then there's also the non-used values, which is the public good values. It's best to think of these as being just general community benefits that benefits everybody if a heritage project happens within a town or city. And so you can say that these non-used benefits would generally be confined to the city or town where the heritage exists. That's not always the case, because it may be a heritage city or town of much wider national or international value. So it could be, well, Krakow's a good example. It's a World Heritage City with, and so there's a lot of interest in the heritage of your city, of heritage of Krakow. There's a lot of interest in that, not just in Poland, but elsewhere in the world. And so those non-use values would accrue to people who are maybe many miles away from the city itself. But mostly these do accrue to the inhabitants, the citizens of the city. There are also spillover effects. This might be induced investment in by other private or public sector authorities. It might be multiplier effects from the investment and so on. I won't go into details about that, because all of this is fairly well known now. But I would just give you the example, I mentioned Fez before, in Morocco, as an example of a city where the non-use benefits, the public good values, were really recognised in some ways for the first time and measured for the first time using the measurement tools that economists have. This goes right back to the early 1990s. Fez is a city in Morocco which has a Medina, which is the central sort of marketplace and surrounding buildings and streets and so on. And there was a proposal from the World Bank to bulldoze the whole lot and build a new urban housing complex there. And fortunately, some people in the World Bank thought, no, there may be alternatives to this. Let's see what would happen if it was possible to rehabilitate the heritage, remake the urban infrastructure in the historic city, bring all the buildings up to date and so on, but preserving the heritage values. And then they did a great big study, probably one of the biggest ones that's ever been done, of the non-use values, the public good values of doing this. And they found that was really quite significant and justified, from the point of view of tourism particularly. Preservation of the heritage allowed the generation of tourist revenue, which was something that justified the project. Let me move on, because I don't want to run out of time to talk about the example. There is a question about whether cultural value can be included in cost-benefit analysis, and we could say that yes, of course, it's possible in principle, in the sense that every heritage project will generate cultural benefits, and these will go on into the future, and there will be a time stream of cultural benefits. But there are problems of specification and measurement, which I won't have time to go into, but we can say at least that it is possible to assess subjective valuations of the cultural values using standard methods. These are the sorts of things that heritage professionals do. We have to do that if we're going to make a nomination for the World Heritage List, and there are criteria that are laid down by UNESCO for for assessing the significance of and importance of cultural heritage. But discounting of the future is an issue in the case of cultural value, because in fact it may be that the heritage is becoming more valuable in the future rather than less value, as most conventional assets do. So we have to be a little bit. There's some sort of interesting theoretical questions that are raised by the existence of the possibility of negative discount rates. What about social value? Yes, of course, there's significant social effects, impact on social cohesion, livability, as we call it, and that's particularly with the association between cultural capital and natural capital, environmental amenity, and then also the possibility of measuring subjective well-being, which is now a concept which has gained a lot of interest in recent times, particularly because it's an alternative at the macro level to GDP as a measure of welfare of people. But I want to move on now to, well, first of all, just the impact assessment. I think I don't need to spend time on this because this is mostly fairly well understood now. The economic impacts, the social impacts, the cultural value creation, and we should also mention the sustainability effects, because one of the characteristics of heritage and cultural capital, like natural capital, is that it generates long-term benefits which can be seen as part of the overall sustainability paradigm, which is now much more relevant and important in the way in which we think about things than has been in the past. Okay, let me go on now to think about the example that I want to take. A colleague and I did some work about 4 or 5 years ago, funded partly by the World Bank, in Saudi Arabia, in the city of Jeddah. Now, Jeddah is a city on the coast of Saudi Arabia, on the Red Sea, and the historic core of the city is very well preserved because the modern city has developed elsewhere. So Jeddah is now quite a big city, and it has a lot of modern buildings and a lot of development, but that's all happened somewhere else. And the central historic core, which is called Al Balad, it's or sometimes just referred to as historic Jeddah, or the old city of Jeddah, is circumscribed by its walls, and it is inscribed on the World Heritage List. That dates back about, I think it was about 2008. It was inscribed onto the World Heritage List. And that was because it is an important example of a city of this type, a port city on the Red Sea. It's the last really surviving example of a style of architecture which was characteristic of that region. It involves particularly open buildings, domestic buildings with wooden balconies, a lot of use and use of the local stone and building materials, and it is really a remarkable city. It also has quite a varied cultural composition, because it has been the main port for pilgrims going to Mecca. They mostly go through Jeddah on the way there, and still do. And so there's been a lot of cultural input and cultural diversity within the city, and that also gives it its own particular character. But there's a problem, and that is that heritage in the city is deteriorating quite rapidly. There is quite a lot of pressure just from neglect, and from this, there are sometimes fires, there are problems of access, and so on. But the site does offer substantial potential for the application of exactly the sort of model that I've been talking about, the application of a heritage-led urban renewal strategy. And this is what my colleague and I were engaged to do a study to try to evaluate the impacts of a heritage-led urban renewal strategy. That is, that there was a proposal for a particular project. Actually, it wasn't a single project, it was a group of projects to invest in the heritage and to stimulate a process of urban renewal. Let me just give you a few examples of the or illustrations of the type of city that it is. There is those buildings show the wooden balconies that I was talking about. These are all open because it's a very hot city, and there's a lot of passage of air through them, and they're beautifully designed for the conditions. There's another one which has been restored, and I think that one was a private house that was restored as a museum, and there've been several cases of that. Here's an example of heritage deterioration, more than deterioration. That one is virtually gone through neglect. It's collapsed more or less completely, and there's a number of buildings within the city like that are in one or other states of disrepair. The next one is yes. This picture illustrates the type of streets. There's narrow walking streets, and again you can see the architecture on the right and in the centre of that slide, and the lining of the shops lining the street are mostly selling old traditional goods of one sort or another, lots of foods and so on. And there's an example of a shopkeeper who makes traditional fabrics, weaving and so on, dyeing of fabrics, and that's typical of the small-scale cultural industries in the site. The project that we did was to look at the economic, social, and cultural impacts of a package of investments which were to happen involving rehabilitation of several buildings, adaptive reuse of buildings, the improvements of the infrastructure. This is very quick. The three slides that I have, one for economic, one for social, and one for cultural impacts, and they really just illustrate the ways in which the sort of techniques that we used, which were survey techniques, which find the proportions of businesses or the proportions of residents who agree or disagree with certain things, or whether they're going to plan to do this or the other or something else. In the case of the economic ones, you can see there, just let's take the first one, which was how many businesses were planning to increase their investments in the next 5 years. 31% said yes, they would, if there wasn't any change in the investment. But if the heritage project went ahead, 60% said they would increase their investments, which indicates that the heritage project would have a very favourable impact on investment. And likewise, you can see on the same slide, you can see that would also cause an increase in employment. In the case of social impacts, that was based on agreement or disagreement with statements about the restoration of historic Jeddah. Would it improve it as a place to live in? 56, well, actually, it's altogether those who agreed, 94%. 56 plus 38%, 94% of residents agreed with that proposition, 56% of them strongly agreed. So, and the same again across the visitors, the institutions, and the businesses. So again, the social impact of the sort of investment that we're talking about here was really quite substantial. The next one was the cultural impacts. Well, this was, the cultural value which would be recognised by the people in the town, in the city, And again, this was a different, I won't go into the detail here, but it's based on a score of a series of statements: strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, and then you assign a score to that and you calculate the average score. And you can see that since one was strongly agree, a value of a score of close to one, it really indicates that people strongly agree with that those propositions. So, I mean, again, it's not... I'm not really able to go into detail on this, but we'll be publishing a paper about this in due course, and so some of these things will be there. Look, I'd just like to finish by saying that I suppose the results of this study do show how taking account of the on-the-ground views and opinions and plans and expectations and responses to heritage investment for the businesses, for the residents, and so on, how this is important, and it can be helped to support the proposition of cost-benefit analysis, which I talked about. One should always say in economics that cost-benefit analysis isn't an end in itself. It's a means to making decisions, and so it provides information which can be useful in making a decision. And so the nice thing about it, or the valuable thing about cost-benefit analysis, or these sorts of methodologies that we've been developing, is that they provide a basis for some sort of objective and rigorous assessment of the benefits and the costs, and so that's very important. And so just finally, it helps, these sorts of analyses do help to open up the possibilities for collaborations, for communications between different specializations, between economists and sociologists and heritage architects and so on, so that the best decisions can be made. So I think, look, I'm sorry we had a break in the middle, and I'm sorry we don't have time for questions, but I'll leave it there and go back to Dr. Wazowska-Pawlik in the studio somewhere, I think you are.
Yes, I am in the studio, and I really wish you could answer at least one question. So I hope that the next
Sure.
session will forgive us this little delay. As there was a question I asked by Barbara, I think, about the cultural, the assessment of culture and social impact, and who does it, and if the investor, being an owner within the World Heritage Site, is obliged to do it or not. And it's so important, let's say, who pays for this cultural and social assessment, because in fact, it depends on the point of view, and from the point of view of a city manager, it is the social impact of any new investment is much more important. We of course need to speak about long time scale, I mean long time perspective, and not 1 or 2 year perspective.
Yes. Look, that's absolutely right, and that's a very good question, because there is always an issue about who's going to pay for these things, because it's not always straightforward. I'd say that the answer really depends on the urban environment, the authority, the jurisdiction, who is doing the planning. If you're talking about the planners, or if you're talking about the private sector who is undertaking this sort of thing, then it depends who the actors are. But one thing I would say is that there are methods for doing this in a systematic way now, and doing it objectively. I mean, one of the difficulties about cultural and even social impacts is that assessment of them tends to be subjective, and people have different opinions, and so it's often easy to dismiss those because they're only subjective, whereas the economic evaluation is always, sort of in monetary terms, which is always understandable. So you have to, accept or understand that there are now objective ways of assessing these things, and the sorts of surveys and the sort of instruments which we've been developing have been aimed at trying to evaluate the social and cultural impacts as well as the economic impacts using the sorts of techniques which can be seen to be objective, rigorous, and replicable.
Thank you. There is one more question from Natasha. Do you think UNESCO Culture for Development indicators can be useful at the local urban level? So maybe this is the...
Yeah, look, they can be.
Oh no, again? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Whoa.
Well, for a moment I thought that...
Well, here we are. We're back again. The technology is a bit daunting. Now, look, the short answer is yes, of course. Those indicators are very have been developed over a long period of time. I had some hand in the early stages of getting those indicators together, and they make a lot of sense. They all add up to an effort to do exactly what I was saying, to try and get some sort of systematic view of what cultural value is and what the cultural sort of indicators should be. And they are actually really very useful and have been useful in a number of developing countries for making exactly assessments. So the answer is yes, they are useful and they can be used, they can be adapted for use in these processes.
Professor Throsby, thank you very much. I'm very sorry we had this technical problems and breaks, but I've seen from the comments that it was your contribution was very needed at that part of the conference and was very inspiring. So thank you very much. I wish you all the best, and I hope that in post-pandemic times we will be able to see each other again.
Indeed. Look, I look forward to that, Agatha. It will be good. And again, I just repeat my congratulations to you and to Jacek Puchler for terrific. It's an absolutely amazing place that you have there, and I can't wait to get back. Maybe next year we might manage next year. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Thank you. Yes.